Hey guys, it's Graham. What's crackin'? Got a good book for you tonight. I haven't yet talked about the works of Matthew Crawford, even though the two books of his that I've read have ended up on my best of the year list in the years in which I read them. The first one was 2014, the other one was just 2 years ago. He is a self-described philosopher mechanic, and the first book is Shop Class as Soulcraft. Bit of a mouthful, a lot of alliteration in there. This book came onto my radar from my brother Jordan, the one that I refer to as Dr. Farmer. Like my brothers, like my other brother and I, he grew up doing blue collar work with us, and he even eventually got into flipping houses with our parents, learning things like how to tile floors, cut baseboards, paint, texture a wall, do some minor plumbing and electrical work, things like that. We got used to working with our hands growing up. As he went on into academia, he learned just how much of an anomaly it was for somebody to have that blue-collar background going into what was predominantly a white-collar field. There weren't a whole lot of people who were learning the doctorate-level history and philosophy that also knew how to do grunt work. And this book by Crawford covers the overlap between those two. I think subconsciously we tend to distinguish between people that work with their minds and people that work with their bodies. And I never realized why that bothered me until I read what Crawford had to say on the subject. Basically comparing the value of skills in a trade to a paper degree that you get. To give you some background on Crawford, he was a guy that grew up in communes. He got out of it. He started doing physical grunt work in his teens, and then decided that he wanted to legitimize himself by going to college and getting a higher education. We're talking post-grad work, master's in something or other. And he felt like if he wasn't working, in an office, in a cubicle, at a desk, doing thinky work at a computer, then he wasn't legitimate. And so to pay his way through college, he did electrician work and did some painting and did a little bit of mechanical work. And then he got into this $22,000 a year job in the Bay Area in the late 90s, typing crap into a computer, doing work that was so mind-numbing that one day when one of his coworkers admitted to him that he was doing cocaine just to cope with the drudgery of the job, Crawford was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And that was a wake-up call to him. He's like, something's going wrong here. If to do this job, to function at it, you've got to be on coke. And so he realized, like, not only was I making more money as an electrician, but I was also a lot happier. I was kind of my own man. And so he left that behind to go into becoming a motorcycle repairman, hence the picture there on the cover. There's obviously a lot more to it than that, and like most of the books that I plug for you, I want you to go and read it yourself. I'm just trying to give you a general overview of the value of it. But that being said, I'm sorry, I've got stuff tickling my face out here. There are a few passages, that I wanted to share with you. Let me find this one here. As he's talking about the value of skills that you gain through experience, and the way that you measure not somebody's worth, but somebody's competence based on how well or whether they even can perform that skill or demonstrate that skill. That's got more value than somebody saying, well, I've got X amount of seniority in this office job, or I've got this level of degree and that's it. It's like, at the end of the day, you can either bend a pipe or you can't. Let me read you a couple of paragraphs from this here. There is pride of accomplishment in the performance of whole tasks that can be held in the mind all at once, and contemplated as whole once finished. In most work that transpires in large organizations, one's work is meaningless taken by itself. The individual feels that, alone, he is without any effect. His education prepares him for this. It is an education for working in a large organization, and he has difficulty imagining how he might earn a living otherwise. This predisposes him to be deferential to the authority exercised in the organization, however tinged with irony this deference may be, since the organization is that which gives meaning to his work. I remember marking on the side there in the margin, known firsthand, having a sense of, like, oh, this is the only thing that I'm able to do, and the fact that I'm in this organization means that my work has meaning. It's like, if you were to take yourself out of that, what would you do to demonstrate your value? What skills do you have independent of this particular organization that you're a part of? And this is where the analogy that I just made a moment ago about whether you can bend pipe or not. He says, either you can bend conduit or you can't, and this is plain. And you can substitute any other hands-on skill for bending conduit. Either you can run wire and put electricity in an entire shop, or you can't. Either you can lay tile straight and flat, or you can't. Either you can change a tire off of a rim without scratching the aluminum, or you can't. The skill speaks for itself. You don't have to argue with anybody about arbitrary qualities of your work. You can demonstrate it by just showing your work. He says, so there is less reason to manage appearances. There is real freedom of speech on a job site, which reverberates outward and sustains a wider liberality. You can tell dirty jokes. Where there is real work being done, the order of things isn't quite so fragile. That particular passage spoke to me, and not at the time when I read it. I would gain an appreciation for that sentiment a couple of years later. It was late 2014 when I first read this. I was not quite 2 years into my career as a truck driver. I was working at a construction company in Las Vegas. And a couple of years later, I would be with a different company, would be doing unconstruction. We were in demolition at this point. And we brought on a new guy who only lasted a couple of months. He was young, mid-20s. And you could tell pretty immediately that this kid had grown up wealthy, because A, he always bragged about it. B, he drove a nice new truck and he always wanted to drive himself to the job site even though everybody was supposed to carpool. He had to bring his own thing. He had to flaunt it. And he bragged about how he'd never had a job where he made under $100,000 a year. And everybody told him, it's like, dude, you're dropping dynamite in the ground. You found that job now. It was a cool job, and I certainly did very well in it at the time, but it's also a job that, let's say, it hasn't kept up with inflation. But I digress. We noticed two things about this dude, and if you were a longtime listener of my old podcast, it's called Rad Cracker now. It used to be called the Brother Trucker Book Club. I used to do a segment where I would talk about occurrences in my career as a truck driver. I refer to this guy as Bob the Inept Drill Operator because he started as a drill operator. Nobody knows how, least of all the owners of the company, which we all thought that he knew somebody who knew somebody. And no, it turns out this guy just applied and somebody put him in a drill and he acted like he knew what he was doing and he didn't. He sucked at it. Dude lost like $3,000 of steel in the ground in one day. But anyway, he got demoted from the drill operations to blast crew, which is just grunt work, and all you got to do is follow instructions, do what the blast leader tells you to do, set it up right, because we're regulated by the ATF, we're regulated by, you got to be background checked by DHS and DOT and stuff if you're going to be driving trucks, moving explosives or moving accelerants, yada, yada, yada. The point is, it's a very specialized kind of work, and you've got to do it by the book, because if you don't, property damage, people can get hurt, you're blowing stuff up, all right? This guy liked to talk a big game and tell stories about how great he was, and he sucked at doing the actual work. And I remember being able to put this into words after telling this story. He says, if you want to be impressive on a job site, if you want to be liked in that larger area of work, all you've got to do is work hard and work well. People will judge your value by the quality of your work. There's an inverse principle to that as well, where if your work is so excellent and reliable and consistent, you can even get away with kind of being the jerk that nobody wants to deal with, because, okay, they'll deal with you if they know that you can get the work done. If the work that you do supersedes any of your other arbitrary qualities, they'll keep you around and you'll earn a solid living at it. And it's more than just a numbers thing, a math thing, a money thing. There's a real valuable philosophy underneath all that to be picked apart. There's one last paragraph that I highlighted on this particular page. It says, "Not surprisingly, it is the office rather than the job site that has seen the advent of speech codes, diversity workshops, and other forms of higher regulation. Some might attribute this to the greater mixing of the sexes in the office, but I believe a more basic reason is that when there is no concrete task that rules the job, an autonomous good that is visible to all, then there is no secure basis for social relations." That goes back to what I was just talking about. "Maintaining consensus and preempting conflict becomes the focus of management, and as a result, everyone feels they have to walk on eggshells. Where no appeal to a carpenter's level is possible, sensitivity training becomes necessary." When you can't measure the value of your time there by the quality of the work that you do, then it just becomes, for lack of a better term, politics. Managing people, managing attitudes, managing fifis. And thus HR was created. Anyway, this is an awesome book. I want you to read it. I want you to drop in the comments if you have read it. If you have read it. Sorry, I was covering up the text there. Let me know what you think about it. As a final note, I've got something here that I want to share with you. Make sure that this hasn't gone into Sleepy Heidi mode yet. But a couple of days ago, longtime reader and friend Logan Kersley dropped this on my Facebook page. And let me just read it to you here. He says, "This sounds like a recipe for disaster, eh?" And he sends me this npr.org link to an article that says, "The driver of the big rig, one lane over, might soon be one of these teenagers." Sorry if you can't see that so well. It was, we'll go through some of it. It was about this high school in central Pennsylvania where I'm fortunate to have, excuse me, this one's in Western Maryland. But he was talking about central Pennsylvania later in the article, which, strangely enough, 1 year ago this week, I was over there in Harrisburg for work. Beautiful part of the country, especially at that time of year. He says, it goes like this. "On the grounds of Williamsport High School in Western Maryland, 3 17-year-olds pile into the cab of a white Volvo truck, pens and pads in hand. They record the odometer, check for warning lights, honk the horn, test the brakes. Hey, they're doing a DVIR. It's part of what's called a pre-trip inspection. In the real world, the process takes about 10 minutes. But today, the students move slowly and methodically under the watchful eye of their instructor, Eric Young." Okay, quick note on that. Some companies require a DVIR to take, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Sometimes I've seen it as low as 7. It's kind of all a crapshoot. It's a dice roll. It's, how much does the company trust you to be thorough while you're doing your pre-trip so that you can catch anything that might cause a larger problem later and wreck a 6-figure vehicle. It says, "This fall, for the first time, this Introduction to Trucking course is being offered at the high school as part of a nationwide push to steer young drivers toward an industry in dire need of workers. Over the next decade, the trucking industry says it will need to hire more than 1 million drivers. This coming spring will mark 10 years since I went to trucking school. And I remember back then they were saying that they were short about 150,000 truckers. Obviously that number's only gone up for a number of reasons, which would take a whole other video to get to. There are lots of components as to why people don't go into trucking. But in addition to the challenges of the pay and the lifestyle, I think that a lot of it has to do with how we societally value the people that not only do blue collar work, but do this kind of work specifically. Stereotypes, tropes, however they couch it in TV shows, like, oh, here's this idiot trucker, backwards trucker, whatever. You very seldom get guys like Smokey and the Bandit anymore who are out doing cool things and driving trucks. It's been 45 years since Convoy came out with Chris Christopherson and Ali McGraw. We don't get a lot of cool trucker movies. We're usually these idiots in the background. It's kind of why I have to introduce myself online sometimes as a literate trucker, because people just expect us to not be well-read or verbose, obviously. We're not the kind of people, supposedly, that have really thought out their positions very well. We're just, we're loud and proud and angry and whatever. We can break that stigma of the kind of person who can become a trucker. Just because you're a truck driver doesn't mean that you can't also be, somebody who's philosophically minded or who's well-read in a bunch of different genres. It's like, in addition to a lot of the classics that I've read or that I've listened to via audiobook behind the wheel, I've also listened to a lot of sci-fi, fantasy, YA stuff. I used to have a segment on my blog several years ago called Trucker Man Reads Girly Books, because 8, 9, 10 times a year I'd grab a young adult romance. Some of them have been turned into like Netflix shows now, but just because I liked the genre, and if it was well written, I would read it. It would give me another insight into some different and diverse corner of the human psyche. It's okay to be a trucker who thinks about things. Part of that, going back to the lack of drivers, is that's because of a rapidly aging workforce. The average age of long-haul truck drivers is 46, according to the group. I'm 38. I'm on the underside of that, and I feel old as a driver. At my last job, there were plenty of guys that I trained that were in their early to mid 20s, which I tried to stress that you're getting in ahead of when I did. I went to trucking school when I was 28 and a half, and back then I was a young guy, but I felt like I was older because I was well past the get into college and be the broke single guy. I was married. I had a kid. Still am married. Got 3 kids now, but I felt like I was. It was kind of like a last chance saloon type thing. Like, oh crap, I'm 28, I'm getting into trucking, and then you find out like there are guys that go to trucking school when they're 40. I trained a guy last summer who was 45. By the time I left that job, he was my supervisor. It happens. There are people that are getting into this when they're older because I think they got to break themselves of this stigma of thinking like I couldn't possibly be a trucker. It's beneath me. It's not dignified work or whatever. No, it's this entire country and a significant part of the Western world, the entire world runs on trucking. If you've got it, at some point a truck brought it to you. We do ourselves a disservice, and we do a disservice to the people who do this work when we devalue it. When lifting heavy pallets of goods comes as part of the job, the pool of drivers becomes even smaller. That's true too. There's a lot of behind the windshield stuff that's a little bit easier for the heavier set guys, the guys that aren't really in shape. But the job that I'm in right now is very physically demanding. We're told by the supervisors and stuff like treat yourself as an industrial athlete. You've got to learn recovery. You've got to learn stretching. You've got to pay attention to your diet. That's taking care of your body is going to give you longevity in this line of work. Another reason is lifestyle. Many long-haul truckers say wages aren't high enough to make up for endless days on the road away from their families. Absolutely true. Turnover in the industry is high. I have had 6 jobs in 9 years. 2 of those jobs only lasted 8 months. Another 2 lasted just under 2 years apiece, and now I'm coming up on 2.5 on the last 2. So there's definitely variability on it, and there were different reasons why I got out of each one. Every truck driver is looking for a pay raise, and if he's got to get it somewhere else, he'll go do it. But there's one idea that's gaining traction: getting young drivers into the industry earlier. This right here, I think, is where Logan and I initially came to different conclusions based on the article. He thought it was that the government was going to lower the age for getting a CDL, which you got to be 21. That's set at the federal level. It's not just a state-by-state thing. And I read by it and thought, no, this is a matter of introducing teenagers to the concepts of trucking and also getting them over the initial mental hurdles of thinking that, I can do this, I can get into this line of work. The 8 months that I did OTR, that's over the road, that's long haul trucking, I just kept thinking to myself, this is a job for a single guy. And the veterans in it, the dudes who've been driving with the same company for 10 years, couldn't help noticing that a lot of them were on their 2nd and 3rd marriages. They're gone all the time. That is the nature of the work. And when you're not at home to put the time into your marriage, the marriage often deteriorates. But if you get younger people to come in and get that CDL at 21 and go work 4 or 5 years over the road, where they can use their parents' address for mail and stuff. Their expenses are really low. They get to travel around. They get to see different parts of the country. They can be a company driver. 40 grand to a guy who's 21 with no expenses and no debts is very, very different than 40 grand to a 28-year-old whose wife is at home taking care of the kids and suddenly has a lot more stuff demanding percentages of his income from him. So I think this is a great idea, having a high school class that teaches an introduction to trucking, and not just in the technical sense of doing a pre-trip and learning how to think big, cast your mind big, to drag this 53-foot trailer behind you and learn how to navigate around obstacles and stuff, but also to get over the hurdle of thinking about home life all the time. Get him used to the idea of just go work, be gone 4, 5, 6 weeks. If you've got a best friend that you can get along with, go be a team driver. Holy crap. Finding team drivers is huge. I had a company that I was looking at a couple of years ago that, in a better economy, was going to pay like $7,000 or $8,000 of a sign-on bonus. And they're like, yeah, you'll be gone every other night though, and you got to be a team driver. And I was like, yeah, it's not going to work. Partly because I didn't want to be away from my family, and partly because I didn't want to be assigned to drive with somebody that I didn't know and probably wouldn't get along with. I think it's more likely than not that you won't get along with somebody that you don't know, especially if you've got to be in this closet-sized moving shoebox all day long. You're going to get on each other's nerves. And there are very few people, I think, that even have that kind of best friend who they know that they could live in that same truck-sized space with, that would also want to be a trucker and be gone with them all the time. That's why companies pay very, very huge amounts of money for competent team drivers, just because it's so hard to find them. But again, if you could get a lot of teenagers warmed up to this idea, then when they turn 21, tell them, hey, go do a couple of years of mechanical work somewhere, go work in a garage, go bust tires, go do some grunt work jobs, keep studying your trucking manual, and then when you turn 21, you go get your CDL, go spend a few years over the road. You get to bank most of what you make, and then by the time you're 25, maybe you can go buy your own rig, maybe you can go buy your own house. That's a lot more promising than saying, oh, you need to go into college, you need to get into that system, you need to get $100,000 of debt to your name so that you can achieve a degree because that's what society values. We're past that, and we need to stop acting like that's the norm. This idea that we need to feed our futures into the college industrial complex because it's the only way to achieve legitimacy or real value, only to turn around 10 years later and realize that you spent 6 figures on something that is of no worth, and you could have instead just gotten into a blue-collar trade with a very low cost of entry, and all you got to do is work. I mean, that's an extremely depressing thought to me. My brother has a doctorate in political philosophy, and all that qualifies him to do, sadly, is be a professor of political philosophy. He's talking about going back to grad school. I really wish that these higher degrees of education that cost so much to get into gave you some skill set that was immediately marketable so that you could recuperate the cost that you put into it. Comparatively, trucking school, when I went, if you paid out of pocket, it was like $5,000. If you took a loan, it was $10,000. That's it. That gave you 2 weeks of class learning and 2 weeks of range learning. And if you passed all your tests, you got cleared with the DMV, you pass a medical, you're set. From there, all you got to do is do the work. They interviewed a 17-year-old who went on to talk about the trucking class and going East Coast to West Coast, talking about what he could earn. That's where you make the most money. Blah blah blah. Bringing all this together, I think that generally, if we destigmatize the value of blue-collar work, especially destigmatize it against the supposed value of higher ed and college degrees and stuff, and just encourage people to get into a trade, whether that's truck driving or welding or plumbing and pipe fitting or whatever. If we had more of a philosophical outlook of the value of this kind of work, and steered people towards it, I think we would solve a lot of the problems that we're facing societally today. And I'm not exaggerating on that one. I think a lot of the problems that we have are because we don't have a stoic approach to the value of good hard work. I struggled as a student, through elementary school and middle school into high school with mathematics until the bug bit me when I was 15 years old to get into cars. And suddenly I was buying magazines and I was looking up all the numbers on like these cool sports cars, these big trucks or whatever. I wanted to understand what it all meant. Suddenly I had a drive, I had a reason to get into this and to wrap my head around the conversions between metric and standard, horsepower versus kilowatts, all that stuff. That was when I started to get good at numbers. And I'm very good at it now. I'm very quick at it now. That's what gave me the reason to do it. Putting a grade on it and saying, if you fail at this, you're going to be a failure at life. That wasn't a motivation. You had to give me a reason to be passionate about it. And I found that in a field where I got to work with my hands. From the time that I was 14 to the time that I was 19, every so often I'd go out into the backyard where my dad was restoring a 67 Cadillac DeVille convertible. That was where I gained the basis of my knowledge of mechanics. And, again, working with my hands, working on the Cadillac in the backyard, working on houses after hours in high school. That was the foundation of what made me the worker that I am today, and is what's made me a valuable worker in the field where I am. So it's a big roundabout way of saying it, and this is kind of a longer video. So yeah, I wanted to address that article that Logan sent me, but also recommend that book to you. Crawford's got another one that I'll cover at a separate time. This one's gone on way long enough. But to sum it all up, don't be afraid to be blue collar instead of white collar. That doesn't limit who you are psychologically, intellectually, any of that stuff. I would even argue the opposite, but hey, maybe I'm just a little bit biased. As a final note, if you guys have been checking the video descriptions, I am always linking to my mom's website and my brother's website. My mom is a quilter. She has been for decades and decades. My brother, runs a sign shop, does wood lettering, vinyl lettering and stuff. I'd been meaning to order some things for my shop here. They know what it's like to run a small business. They know what it's like to work with their hands, to manage themselves. And, I think that's significantly more valuable than somebody who paid a lot of money to go get a college degree and doesn't have a lot of real world experience. But, more to the point, I would like them to continue being successful as they have been, throughout their lives in the field of their choice, continuing to move from success to success as they have. So if you want to check out those links and get yourself some signage or some quilts, by all means go do so. And then if you're interested in reading some of my own fiction, I've got a link to my Amazon books down below as well. So thank you for watching through all of this and through my long pauses and my trains of thought going in different direction. I appreciate you guys' patience, and as always, I appreciate the 1,000 of you that are now subscribed. We're just getting started and we're moving onward and upward. Y'all have a good night, drive safe, see you out there.